everybody, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm very pleased to have a guest interview once again, and it's TJ Huizar, who is a young language learner and aspiring polyglot from Arizona, an accomplished polyglot, I should say, from Arizona. Welcome, TJ.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Now, you are still in school. You're 16 at the moment, I think, and you've studied how many languages so far?
About 14 and counting, and it's always going up, so it's very hard to tell, but I'd say around 14.
Because when I discovered you, you're a big vlogger and filmmaker as well on YouTube, and I found a video of yours from the Caucasus. So I know that you're interested in languages from all over the world, but you said that language is a game of passion for you. And how did you get your language passion then?
The first passion I ever got was when I traveled to China, I would say. Before that, I didn't really investigate our world that much, but it wasn't until that trip that I met people outside of my culture that I started to love language, and each individual language for me has its own reason for why I'm passionate about it. It could be I've watched a video in that language that I really loved, or I talked to someone in that language. So it's different for every language, but passion is definitely key.
And is that from the perspective of motivation on a daily basis as well? Are you one who likes to work regularly at your languages, a little bit each day? And what energy, what sources of inspiration do you draw on, once the initial enthusiasm has worn off?
Yeah, I would say that being consistent in your studying is very important, because if you're studying every day and then you miss a few days, it becomes missing a few weeks and stuff like that. And that always ends up me not learning the language. And for me, I've realized that music and movies are things that can motivate you to stay consistent, because if there's a song you love in the language and you listen to it, it will remind you why you started in the first place. And I always do that. I have a playlist of songs in all my languages that I use to keep me motivated, to keep me in the right headspace when I'm studying.
So it's about constantly going back to those initial sources of enthusiasm as a way of maintaining consistency.
Yeah, yeah, I'm a big fan in the power of nostalgia, passion, all those things that are very fiery, things that can really get you motivated to do something.
What would you say your best languages are, the languages you've got furthest with so far?
I would say French, mainly because I studied it for so many years in school and at home alone. And I've watched so many films in French. I've studied a lot of vocabulary. So I'd say I'm pretty good at French. My Spanish is close behind. I've been speaking it for a while now. My dad speaks it, but I didn't necessarily learn it from him. But I'm exposed to the culture, so it's a lot easier where I live. And Russian, I only learned it for about 2 months, but it got pretty good for my trip. And then there's many other languages like Polish and let's see, a lot of Central Eastern European languages, mainly Slavic ones like Slovak. My Portuguese isn't bad, so all those languages. It's just the ones that I've studied the longest, I would say.
When you're starting a new language, TJ, how do you begin? What do the first few weeks look like, or first couple of months for that matter?
So for the first month, or for the first week, I study as much vocabulary as I can, a lot of intake. So it's all about getting a base in vocabulary, a base in grammar too. And then after that, I start speaking. I use italki, things like that. And eventually I just keep doing that until hopefully I can go on a trip to that region. And while I'm just doing those italki lessons, I write down the vocabulary, record it into my flashcard app, and I just keep doing that, keep building vocabulary. And I also refer to grammar every now and then to obtain a new grammatical aspect, and I can use that. And yeah, eventually it just progresses and progresses.
So you said initially then in the first weeks you're building up some basic vocabulary, some basic grammar, but where are you getting that from? I think you're a fan of the colloquial series of textbooks. So would you be using those at that first stage?
Yeah, I use a mix of my colloquial books, which I have so many of. I've just kind of collected them over the years. And then I also use words that I hear in context. I maybe watch like a little clip in, let's say I'm studying Malaysian. I'll watch a clip in the Malay language, see words that are really useful. There's these certain power words that come up a lot in conversation that you need to learn as soon as possible. And there are, I would say that where school messes up is that they focus on more distinct vocabulary and more exotic vocabulary, if you must. But I think that I need to study more common vocabulary, words like, for example, of course, and words like that need to be addressed first, so you can come off as more understandable, more casual, and even more fluent in the beginning steps.
So it's useful chunks to move a conversation forward, as it were. But
Exactly.
you say initially you're learning Malay, which is your 14th language, then I guess. But okay, you might find something on YouTube, say, but you're talking about picking out important words, but without any base, you're not going to be able to recognize even individual words, let alone which of them are more important.
That's a good point. I would say it's because I've studied so many languages that my process, I've just refined which words I need and which ones I don't. And it's different for everyone, so I can't really say which 600 words you need at first. You really have to figure out for yourself which ones are useful, because everyone has individual interests. And I like to talk about countries, culture, things like that. So when I'm having conversations, it's usually using vocabulary from that topic. So that works for me.
And do you find that the colloquial textbooks, for example, have quite some of this useful vocabulary in them?
I would say so. It always has the words like always, and it has the grammar too, which is something that's kind of hard to come by in a lot of textbooks. But yeah, the colloquial series, it has books for about 50 languages, and I think they're all pretty well made. There are a few that were black sheep, sort of, but I think that the colloquial series has really good vocabulary. It has a great dictionary as far as common usage goes. It has text and like dialogue practices. I use those sometimes, but most of the time I like to watch videos to do my dialogue practice.
So you wouldn't be necessarily, or would you be working thoroughly through? Would you say, I'm going to work through all the chapters of a colloquial or whichever course book you have first, and I'm going to put sentences or chunks into Quizlet or to Anki, and then I'm going to start listening? Or is it all more mixed up than that?
Yeah, I would say it's just mixed up. I just try to do as much as possible in the first week, especially because that's when I have the most passion for a language. So I try to take advantage of that. So I use my book, I use my Quizlet or Anki, I use both of them. And I start listening to music and analyzing the lyrics all at the same time. So I usually do it at different parts of the day, morning, afternoon, night. And yeah, that usually works for me. Just having everything done at once and just staying motivated to do it every day.
It reminds me of what the German polyglot Judith Mayer says. She always says that she sort of starts to find her initial enthusiasm tailing off after about 60 days. And so her aim is to get as far as she can in those first 60 days so that she's got enough velocity, if you like, to carry her forward.
Exact velocity is like the perfect way to describe it, because you just have this momentum, and after a certain time it peaks at a certain point and it just kind of goes down, or you get interested in another language, and that's another challenge, staying on one language and not going back to another language or trying a new one. So yeah.
So when you started, you've been working with a textbook, you've been finding audio, pulling out words, making lists of words or phrases, using some spaced repetition. And then you said a few weeks in, you're moving into conversations online, one-to-one with italki, say. And how would your sessions typically, what would a typical session for you online, one-to-one look like? Would it be with an exchange partner, or do you pay for teachers?
I usually pay for teachers just because what I get out of it is worth money. So I usually pay, let's say $4 for an hour of lesson. But what I do is I just have a conversation about anything. I don't really plan anything because I'm trying to learn vocabulary that is casual and normal in conversation. So what I do is I have my journal right next to me. I write down words that I encounter in the conversation that I've not learned or I forgot. And later after the lesson, I add them to my vocabulary deck and I study those, try to use them in the next lesson. And that really works for me because it's just a constant building and you're studying each time and progressing each time. And when you're speaking, the progression is very visual. You can see how much you progress each time.
And would you think in advance of which topics to talk about? Because one risk, I suppose, when you're seeing a teacher is that you end up in a rut talking about, your life, which all of us have in a sense, repetitive lives or repetitive topics. Do you make a conscious effort to talk about new things, or do you just see which way the flow takes you?
I think I always start with talking about the country because it's different for each language. So I'm learning Malay. I had a lesson where I was talking about Malacca and Kuala Lumpur. And when I was learning Farsi, I was talking about Tehran and Persepolis. And I talked about all these regions of the world. So not only are you learning the language, but you're also learning some more geography, more cultural geography, I could say. So it's a double win.
So you'd go for a 1 hour session normally, and how often would you meet with a teacher then online when you're in that phase?
When I'm in that phase, I would do maybe 2, 3, or 4 lessons a week. Depends on my schedule, but really, ideally, I try to do 3 a week, maybe 2 on the weekends, 1 in the weekday, and I try to maximize them. So I'm not just taking them just to take them, but I take them when I'm feeling like I need to progress more or I'm running out of motivation to learn more vocabulary, because those are always like boosts to learn more and to study more.
And so you studied Russian a lot last year before you went to the Caucasus. Presumably before that trip, you were having quite a few of these types of lessons. But what about maintenance of the languages where you've got a bit more experience? Do you still book in sessions with teachers?
I think for languages like French and Russian, I do them about once a month. But really, I only like to study languages when I know I'm going to use them, or I like to maintain them when I know I'm going to use them, because it can be quite expensive and quite time consuming to study 14 languages every month, because that's pretty much half of the month spent maintaining languages instead of learning a new one. And I think that if I were to go back to Russia, say, I would definitely study more Russian and build off of what I have. And same with French, same with Spanish.
My experience has been, I don't know about you, but once you get to a certain level, there's a solid basis that does stay. And this idea of getting rusty, that is just what it is. But once you start cranking the wheels into action again, after a few days, I often feel really nervous if I haven't spoken a language for a long time. But once you get back there, you sort of get back into it, don't you, almost?
Exactly. It's
I
almost
think.
instant. Yeah.
When you're starting off, how about pronunciation? How important is that? Would you say? You know, at the beginning of these books, they always have a section on pronunciation. Do you skip that, or do you really focus in on it?
I focus enough on it, I would say. I'm not trying to butcher the pronunciation. and I usually use the IPA transliteration, so it's as native sounding as possible. And they obviously know I'm not going to be a native speaker, so I'm not trying to sound like a clandestine agent. I'm not trying to disguise myself. So I just think that learning and comprehending the accent helps you. And with things like immersion and speaking practice, you are able to pick up the accent more naturally. So over time, I do try to get that accent.
Yeah, that sounds sort of logical to me. I always think, like you, I don't want to work as a spy, so it doesn't have to be perfect. I try and
Mm,
focus in on the key differences with English, the new sounds, or where there are contrastive phonemic differences,
exactly.
and you know, try and work on those a bit. And then I take the view it would come with practice anyway. And as you say, I always feel, you know, you don't want to disguise your identity where you're from. You just don't want your pronunciation to get in the way of
That
the
of
locals
understanding of all that.
understanding you, because we've all had that experience when we're talking to someone who's got bad English pronunciation, where you're trying to understand, but you can only say, can you repeat that so many times to them before you feel really, really bad? So I don't want to
Mhm.
be like that the other way around, I suppose. um, what about reading reading as a way of maintaining a language or of widening vocab? Are you into that?
Reading is a good way to study languages. I often find it difficult to find resources in some languages, but when I can find them, I try to get them as quick as possible. But it's very tricky to find the perfect level of reading because if you're A2 in a language, say, then it'll be difficult to read B1 literature if you don't understand it, and it might be frustrating in the beginning. And I honestly prefer watching films because with the subtitles in the native language, because you're still focusing. And if it's a film that you've already seen, you can use the context of the film to understand vocabulary. And I think between film and reading, I would say I prefer film just because you also get to hear the language, and that's what I like about it.
And I suppose, yes, having the context, it is more like real life learning, isn't it? When we're small children, we can always see what's being talked about. It's very concrete initially, and use the cues and the additional cues there. Now, you've learnt, I think, two languages with a different alphabet, Persian and Russian, or different writing system. We'll maybe talk about Chinese in a moment. But those
Mhm.
two, which have, I know they look scary, folks, but they're actually quite simple, I think, writing systems once you focus in on them. How have you found those? How much did it slow you down having to learn the Cyrillic alphabet or to write in Persian?
It's actually quite funny because for Russian, Persian, Korean, Hebrew, all the Arabic alphabet, Amharic even, Devanagari for Hindi, I can read pretty much most alphabets. I've studied a lot of alphabets as a kid, or when I started language learning, and it usually only takes me about a day to learn these things because it's just about reading practice and referring to the alphabet or writing system and just trying to read words and just eventually you're able to read these things like hiragana and katakana. I would just write, or I would just have words say, and if I didn't know the character, I would just look back at the chart, and eventually it just sticks in your head. Um, and usually, yeah, 1 to 2 days is all it takes for those, for me at least.
I find that while it's surprisingly quick, actually, uh, I do nevertheless find I'm very much slowed down when I'm actually reading. But
Yeah.
then I sort of look back and think, well, it took me ages to learn to read the Latin alphabet, actually. So obviously it's going quicker than that because we're adults. Um, yeah, I don't know. Does that accord with your experience?
Yeah, I think that reading, I always prefer to read in the Latin alphabet or in English just because the sake of speed. But if I need to, let's say I'm in a shop or reading a menu in Russian. Of course, I'll be able to read it because I don't really have the choice. But if I'm on a website, say, I just think it's more efficient to read a language that you can understand, like French or Russian's pretty good for me because the writing system's fairly simple. But Persian, since it doesn't have a lot of vowels, it's kind of more time consuming to read if you don't know the vocabulary term, and it's quite tedious, I would say.
Do you use, because writing has made a bit of a comeback in the current generation with all the texting, online social media, chat rooms, and so on. Do you use the written word in that way to communicate in groups? Do you use Instagram or any other platform to connect with other learners or practice commenting under posts in native communities almost online?
I would say I prefer speaking just because writing, like I said, I prefer to have that accent. I prefer to hear the language rather because when you're talking to someone, um, let's say when I'm filming a documentary, I'm not necessarily writing the language, and it's more of a speaking aspect for me. And I just don't find the writing system as practical for me in terms of learning. I do like watching or like reading comments in French languages that I'm more developed in. I like reading in. So I'd say around that B1, B2 level is when I start reading and uh, texting in the language too.
And what about Mandarin Chinese then? You learned some of that for your trip to China. Did you tackle the writing system at all, or did you just work to the extent you were using the written language with transliteration?
Chinese was actually the first language I learned, and I didn't really have a clue what I was doing. But luckily, I learned the writing system at least, I would say 700 characters, so I can still read it pretty well. But I also learned it in school last year. I only learned it for 1 year in school, but that was just to get the writing system down. And I think that Chinese is a difficult writing system to tackle, and it really takes decades to master. But as far as understanding food, menus, item labels, things like that, it doesn't take too long to understand those basic Hanzi.
And how did you go about learning those 700 then?
I think I just learned them through reading, a lot of reading in Chinese. I also actually texted in Chinese with my friends in China, and being able to recognize those characters while reading is very easy for me. But when I'm writing, I can't really write more than maybe 50 characters, which is actually a common phenomenon in China too, where the kids aren't able to write the characters because they're so used to texting nowadays. And when I had a writing final in Chinese, I had to write 150 characters, and that was quite difficult for me. Just recalling what the characters look like in your brain is trickier, but it's doable. It's not too difficult.
So initially, when you were starting to read, were you were looking backwards and forwards constantly to a glossary or something? Were you in a textbook or?
Yeah, I have a few dictionaries and uh, glossaries exactly that I would use to find the characters that I didn't know or ones that I see in a restaurant even. I could use like Google Translate to snap a photo of it. And when I was in the Chinese restaurant, I could learn more characters. And that's just sort of what I did. It was over time that I learned the Chinese characters. And unfortunately, I haven't studied them in a while. I really want to get back to Chinese this summer because it's quite rusty since I haven't used it in over 3 years. Uh, I've had some conversations, but where I live, there's not too many Chinese speakers that you encounter on a day-to-day basis.
Um, you studied Latin at school, and you studied Russian and several other, I think, Slovak. Um, Polish now, Slavic languages. So have you found that having the base in Latin and other Latin languages like French, Spanish helps with others in that family? And the same with the Slavic languages? Or does it just confuse you and everything ends up as a mush?
I think when I studied Latin, actually, it was in middle school, and uh, it was just tricky for me because that was before my language learning days, I would say. But understanding how it works, the basic concept of case endings, that was useful when learning Slavic languages. But when the case endings really clicked was when I went to Slovakia with my friend Thomas. He's from there. Well, he was born here, but his family's from there. So we went to uh, Western Slovakia, and there I was able to hear the case endings and kind of familiarize myself with them. And I could take that to when I studied Russian and then Polish, and luckily Bulgarian doesn't have them, so that was an easy one. But the cases are quite difficult.
Yeah, and I suppose it's quite unusual these days to study Latin when you're in, say, in middle school. So that prepared you twice over, once for the sort of vocabulary and the verb base for the related descendant languages, and once because you know what this case system is,
Exactly.
how it works, even if in in rather different languages. So we've talked about a whole range of languages and your approach, and I've got quite a clear idea, I think, of the way you go about things. It's quite eclectic. It's always with passion. Everybody does it in different ways with a different mix, I suppose, but we're also all people with a different range of talents and strengths. And I wonder what you feel are your particular strengths when you come to language learning that really help you.
I would say that I've always loved storytelling and understanding just more about everything. So that curiosity has always led me to having great conversations, meeting great people. And I think that curiosity also helps me talk with people because some language learners find it difficult to have conversations or things like that. But I really have no problem with that. I often just walk into villages in Armenia or just go to random places and it doesn't bother me at all because I'm just so curious to understand more, and that has helped my language learning, I would say.
And I suppose an obvious question to finish, TJ, would be with your sort of 14 languages and counting, which languages are you currently eyeing up, as it were, and do you hope to move on to?
That's a great question. I have about 30 languages that I would love to learn, not fluently, of course, but to this A2 level, because when I'm filming my documentaries, I always want to be able to speak the native language. Otherwise, they just don't work. And I'm planning to go to places like Eastern Europe, all over Asia. So having those plans in place, I can see which languages I need to learn. Um, Cambodian, for example, I need to learn Vietnamese, Tagalog for later this year, perhaps. And I think the A2 level for me is good enough for most languages because I can have a conversation and understand what I need to, and I can convey what I need to. And I think that for other languages, I'll do B2, C1, like French and Spanish, languages that are more practical in a sense for international diplomacy or things like that. And I think I'll study at least around 30 languages by the time I'm 18 or so. And I have a lot of time right now, so I'm trying to study as many as possible.
Well, in some ways, it sounds like quite a tall order, TJ, but given how far you've come already, maybe I should be putting money on it. Maybe you'll tell us in 2 years' time, it's only 2 years, whether you've actually managed that. But it's a hugely inspiring story. And thanks for taking the time today to going into so much detail about your language learning practice. And best of luck on that journey towards those 30 languages. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank
Everybody,
you.
thanks a lot as always for watching. And don't forget, if you haven't yet, subscribe for the vibe. Please do. Don't forget to throw me a thumbs up, tickle that bell, and share the affair. See you next time. Bye.